Have you ever tried to warn someone about imminent danger and they simply didn't believe you? That feeling of helplessness, of knowing something terrible is about to happen, but your words seem to echo in the void. Well, imagine living through that, not for days, but for entire months. That was the reality for Harold Mitchell, a 68-year-old night watchman who, in September 2019, made his 10th desperate call to the Detroit police. "The lights on the 14th floor are changing pattern again," he repeated with a trembling voice, already expecting the answer that would come. On the other end of the line, only a sigh of impatience. Once again, no one believed him. No one ever believed him. But what Harold didn't know that cold September night was that he was just a few steps away from discovering an absolutely terrifying truth. A truth that would save 43 people from an impending tragedy. Stay with me until the end, because this true story will show you how an ordinary man, ignored and ridiculed by everyone, became a true hero simply because he refused to stop paying attention. We're talking about an old commercial building in downtown Detroit, Michigan, 18 stories of concrete, glass, and forgotten histories. To most people, just another 1960s building lost in time. But to Harold, that building was practically a living organism. He knew every sound, every creak, every shadow that danced through the empty hallways during his nightly rounds. And for the past 3 months, something had been profoundly wrong. The lights on the 14th floor, a floor that should have been completely empty since the accounting firm went bankrupt, were flickering on and off in strange, almost hypnotic patterns. Have you ever experienced this? That inexplicable feeling that something isn't right even when you can't prove it. Harold felt it down his spine every night. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because those lights weren't flashing randomly. There was a pattern. There was a message. And Harold, with his seemingly paranoid obsession and his battered notebook full of notes, was about to decipher a code that would change everything. Before I tell you what Harold discovered in that worn notebook, and believe me, it will be chilling, I need to ask you something. If you feel this story is affecting you, if it's somehow bringing back that feeling of when nobody took you seriously or when you noticed something others ignored, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Seriously, I read every comment, and these stories you share form an incredible community of people who believe that details matter, that intuition has value, and that persistence pays off. And look, if you're enjoying this content, leave a like below. I know it seems like a simple request, but each like is a signal to YouTube that real stories like this, which remind us of our humanity, deserve to be seen by more people. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Stories that aren't about celebrities or gossip, but about anonymous heroes who make a difference in silence. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you real stories that will make you believe again in the strength of ordinary human beings. Stories that mainstream media doesn't tell, but that need to be told. You're part of this now. Now let's go back to Harold and that 14th floor. Because what he was about to discover that September night wasn't just a mystery about flashing lights. It was difficult to look at Harold Mitchell and see a hero. In fact, most people barely looked at him. At 68, in his worn navy blue uniform, and with a flashlight he insisted on carrying, even when the hallway lights worked perfectly, Harold was practically invisible. 12 years working as a night watchman at the Empire State Building, and no, before you think of New York, we're talking about an office building built in the 1960s in Detroit, Michigan, that shared only its name with the American icon. A forgotten building, in a city struggling to reinvent itself, guarded by a man most considered irrelevant. Harold had been a widower for 7 years. He lost his wife Margaret to cancer, and since then the night shift had become more than just a job. It was his refuge, his purpose, perhaps even his way of avoiding facing an empty house. A former Navy veteran, he had the rigid demeanor of someone who had served his country, but he also carried the silent weight of someone who had seen things he preferred to forget. His colleagues on the day shift saw him as that grumpy old man who complains about everything. The guy who pointed out when a light bulb burned out on the 3rd floor, when the basement door creaked differently, when the ventilation system made a strange noise on Tuesdays. But Harold had a gift that no one valued, he observed. It wasn't just looking, it was truly paying attention. While the world rushed to its screens, its distractions, its hectic lives, Harold knew every sound, every shadow, every microscopic detail of that 18-story building. To him, the building was practically a living organism. He knew when elevator number 2 was about to break down, 3 weeks before it did. He knew when it had rained too much, because the 10th floor smelled different. He knew the exact pattern of how the streetlights reflected on the lobby windows at 2 in the morning. This attention to detail, this almost spiritual connection to the space he guarded every night, was seen as eccentricity. But it was precisely this characteristic, this seemingly senseless obsession with patterns and imperceptible changes, that would transform Harold from a forgotten watchman into someone whose name would be remembered for decades. Because for the past 3 months, something had been profoundly wrong, and Harold felt it in every fiber of his being. The transformation began in June. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but his intuition, the same intuition that kept him alive during storms at sea when he served in the Navy, screamed that the building was trying to tell him something. The 14th floor, empty since Jacobson and Associates, an accounting firm, declared bankruptcy and left the space behind desks, chairs, and dust-covered files, began to show signs of life. Or at least, signs of something. The lights. Those damned lights that danced in the windows between 11:30 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., creating patterns that defied any logical explanation. Harold began documenting everything in a black notebook he carried in his pocket. First 3 windows lit up, then 5, then 2. Always the same sequence, always at the same time. It wasn't an electrical fault, he'd already checked. It wasn't a reflection from outside lights. He'd already tested that. It was something deliberate, something intentional, and it kept him awake during the day, when he should have been sleeping. He filed formal reports with the building management. He sent emails. He called the police 5 times before that fateful 10th call. The responses ranged from indifference to irritation. "Mr. Mitchell, you need to stop wasting our time with this nonsense." But Harold couldn't stop, because he knew, with that unwavering certainty that comes from years of observation, from decades of trusting his own instincts, that something or someone was up there, and whatever it was trying to communicate. But what Harold didn't yet know was that those lights weren't just a mystery to be solved. The obsession began almost imperceptibly, like all great revelations in life. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in June, around 11:45 p.m., when Harold was making his usual rounds through the outside parking lot. He always took a general look at the building from the outside before going back inside, a Navy habit, checking the entire perimeter. It was at that moment that he saw it. 3 windows on the 14th floor lit up simultaneously. Then they went out. 5 seconds of darkness. Then 5 different windows lit up. They went out again. Another 5 seconds. 2 windows lit up. The next day, Harold went up to the 14th floor during his shift. Unlocking that door always gave him the creeps. The silence up there was different, denser, almost oppressive. He walked through the empty hallways of Jacobson and Associates, where dust-covered desks held 2018 calendars, dried-out pens, and forgotten picture frames with photos of smiling families. Everything exactly as it had been for months. No sign that anyone had been there. No footprints in the thick dust covering the grey carpet. No forced entry. No indication of a break-in. But Harold couldn't shake that feeling, that deep, unsettling intuition that something was happening there. That night, he saw it again. Exactly at 11:47 p.m. The same sequence. 3 windows. 5 windows. 2 windows. Always the same. Pattern. Always the same time interval. These weren't random patterns from a power outage or external interference. They were deliberate, methodical, almost rhythmic sequences. And that changed everything in Harold's mindset. This wasn't a coincidence. It was communication. He began carrying his battered notebook, one of those black spiral-bound ones that had seen better days, and started documenting everything with military precision. Date, exact time, number of windows, interval between each. Sequence, duration of each light on. Harold filled page after page, creating a meticulous record of something that no one else seemed to see or care about. During the day, when he should have been resting for the next night shift, he stayed awake analyzing his records, looking for patterns within patterns, trying to decipher what it all meant. The building management received its first formal report in mid-June. Harold typed it on an old computer in the public library, printed it on letterhead. He had designed himself and personally delivered it to the facilities manager. The reply came 3 days later by email. Mr. Mitchell, we appreciate your dedication, but we have already checked the electrical system on the 14th floor and everything is working normally. It's probably reflections from streetlights or neighboring buildings. No need to worry. But Harold knew they weren't reflections. He knew every reflection in that building. The first call to the police happened in the 3rd week of June, after the pattern repeated itself for 15 consecutive nights. The operator was polite but clearly skeptical. Sir, is the floor empty? Yes. No signs of forced entry? Correct. Then it's probably an electrical problem. Contact building maintenance. Harold tried to explain that it wasn't an electrical problem, that there was a pattern, an intention, but on the other end of the line they were already ending the call. Second call, same answer, less patience. Third call, an audible sigh before the standardized response. Fourth call, Mr. Mitchell, we already sent a patrol car to check last week, and they found nothing. You need to stop calling emergency services about this. Fifth call, Mr. Mitchell, you are wasting public resources. If you continue calling without a real emergency, we may take action. Even his own daughter, Jennifer, began to question his mental state. Dad, you haven't slept properly in weeks. You're obsessed with those lights. Maybe it's time to talk. To someone, you know. Or think about retiring. You've already made your contribution, you've worked your whole life. Harold listened in silence, but inside something burned. It wasn't irrational obsession, it was certainty. That same certainty that made him trust his instincts when he was at sea during storms, that other sailors didn't take seriously. The hidden truth was there. Harold could feel it. And the journey to uncover it was only beginning, even if it meant facing the disbelief of everyone around him. Because some decisions in life aren't about what others think. They're about what you know to be true, even when you can't prove it yet. If you're feeling that connection to Harold's persistence, to that refusal to give up when everyone says you're wrong, subscribe to the channel. You're part of this community of people who believe that the truth is always worth pursuing, no matter how many doors are slammed in your face. But the revelation that was to come was something that not even Harold, with all his experience and intuition, could have imagined. July turned into August and Harold's routine changed completely. Now, every night, without exception, he went up to the 14th floor. The key creaked in the lock, the echo of his footsteps in the empty hallway. The smell of mold and old paper permeated every corner of that abandoned space. He walked slowly, methodically, checking every door, every window, every inch of that ghostly floor. Locked doors, empty offices, covered in a layer of dust that seemed undisturbed in months. No sign of intrusion, no footprints other than his own, no physical evidence that anyone or anything had been there. But the lights kept changing. Every night, always at the same time, always the same hypnotic pattern that Harold could now predict with his eyes closed. And this contradiction between what he saw from the outside and what he found from within began to erode his confidence. For the first time in decades, Harold Mitchell began to question his own senses. Was he going crazy? Was loneliness, age, the loss of Margaret finally taking its toll? That's when he made a decision that would change the course of his entire journey. Harold spent $230, almost a third of his monthly salary, on a used security camera he found at a pawn shop. It was one of those old ones that recorded on VHS tapes, heavy as a brick, and with image quality that made everything blurry. But it was what he could afford. He installed the camera in the hallway on the 14th floor, pointed directly at the area where the lights usually came on. He plugged it into an outlet hidden behind a dead plant, concealed the cables as best he could, and began recording. Every morning before going home, Harold would collect the tape, take it to his small apartment and watch it. He would rewind it, He would watch it again in slow motion. He would write down every detail in his notebook, and he found absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing appeared in the recordings. The hallway remained empty, motionless, dead throughout the night. Not a movement, not a shadow, not a single frame that would explain how those lights could be turning on in such a coordinated way. But when Harold went downstairs and looked from the outside, there they were again. 3 windows, 5 windows, 2 windows. The pattern continued, relentless, mocking him, defying all logic. It was as if the building was playing with him, revealing its hidden truth only to those who looked from the right angle, concealing its inner workings from any attempt at documentation. This heartbreaking contradiction between evidence and experience began to transform Harold. He lost 6 pounds. He stopped shaving regularly. His eyes became permanently red from watching and re-watching those grainy tapes. Jennifer showed up at the building one night, worried. She had called her father's cell phone 17 times without answer. "Dad, look at yourself. You're not okay. You're obsessed with this. You're becoming paranoid." She took his hands, and Harold noticed how they were trembling. "Maybe it's time to retire, travel a bit, see the grandchildren more often. This is consuming you, and why? Because of some flashing lights." Harold wanted to explain. He wanted her to understand that it wasn't paranoia, that something real was happening there, that his intuition had never betrayed him before. But how to explain the inexplicable? How to defend his sanity when the only evidence he had were notes in a notebook and a visceral feeling in his stomach? That night, alone in his guardhouse on the ground floor, Harold opened the notebook for the 100th time. He looked at months of records, patterns within patterns, numbers that danced across the pages without forming a clear meaning. Maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe it was time to accept that sometimes our minds play tricks on us, that not every mystery has a solution, that not every intuition is correct. He closed the notebook slowly, as if saying goodbye to something important. He almost gave up. Almost. But then something changed. A subtle shift in his mindset that came from a completely unexpected place. Harold remembered something his commander used to say in the Navy. "Mitchell, when you can't solve a problem head-on, change the angle of attack." And that's exactly what he did. And what Harold was about to discover would prove that his persistence, his refusal to accept easy answers, was about to save lives in a way no one could have imagined. Friday night, September 13th, 2019, began like any other. Harold arrived at work at 10:30 p.m., changed in the tiny locker room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, and took his post. But there was something different about that night. Perhaps it was the accumulated fatigue from months of sleepless nights. Perhaps it was the resignation of someone about to give up. Or perhaps it was simply fate setting the stage for a revelation that would change everything. Around 11:15 p.m., Harold opened his notebook once more. Not to add new entries, but almost as a farewell ritual. He had decided that this would be his last week, observing the lights. Jennifer was right. It was time to let go. He flipped through the pages filled with numbers, dates, sequences written in the shaky handwriting of someone writing in the dark. 3 windows, 5 windows, 2 windows, pause, 3 windows, 1 window, 4 windows, pause. The patterns repeated page after page, and Harold had memorized them like a song you can't get out of your head. Then it happened. That moment of absolute clarity that only comes when you stop forcing it and let your mind make natural connections. Harold was looking at the sequences when something clicked. They weren't random numbers. They were intervals. They were durations. They were codes. His heart began to race. His hands trembled as he gripped the notebook. In the Navy, nearly 50 years. Ergo, Harold had learned Morse code. It was mandatory for all sailors at the time. He hadn't used it in decades, but certain things get etched into the muscle memory of his mind. 3 flashing windows, 3 dots, was S. 5 windows with a longer duration, 3 dashes, 2 dots, could be... Harold picked up a pencil with trembling hands and began to translate. 3 short dots, 3 long dashes, 3 short dots. SOS? No, that wasn't quite it. He went back to the first page of June's logs and... began to systematically decode it. First sequence, HELP. The letters formed before him like a divine revelation. Help, help. Someone was calling for help. Harold felt the air escape his lungs. He continued translating feverishly, sweat dripping down his forehead. Second sequence, repeated countless times throughout July. TRAPPED, trapped, trapped. Third sequence, which appeared only in August, 14F, 14th floor. Someone was trapped on the 14th floor and had been calling for help. For 3 months, 3 whole months screaming for help through the only language they could use, light. And Harold had been the only person in the entire world paying attention. His blood ran cold. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't irrational obsession. It wasn't the mind of a lonely old man playing tricks. It was real. Someone was up there. Someone who knew Morse code. Someone desperate enough to spend months manipulating electrical wiring to create these patterns. Someone who was probably dying at this very moment while Harold stood there with a notebook in his hands. The transformation in Harold's face was instantaneous. His tired eyes gained laser focus. His hands stopped trembling. His posture changed. The soldier he had been decades ago resurfaced. He grabbed his flashlight, that old heavy maglite that served both to illuminate and to defend himself. He grabbed his walkie-talkie. He checked if his cell phone was in his pocket. And then, with a determination he hadn't felt in years, Harold dialed 911 for the 10th time. But this time it was different. There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation. "Hello, 911 emergency. What is the nature of your emergency?" The operator sounded bored. Harold took a deep breath. "My name is Harold Mitchell. I'm a security guard at the Empire State Building in Detroit, at the corner of Woodward and Grand Boulevard. There's a person trapped on the 14th floor of this building. They've been calling for help for 3 months using Morse code." Through the lights, I decoded the message. "It's help trapped 14F. I need a rescue team here now." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, are you the one who called several times about flickering lights?" Harold felt anger rising, but he controlled it. "Yes, that's me, and I was right all along. Someone is dying upstairs while we're talking. Are you going to send help, or am I going to have to break down that door myself, and if something goes wrong, it's going to be on your back?" Another pause. He could hear rapid typing. "Sir, I'll send a patrol car to check. Stay where you are." Harold hung up. He wasn't going to stay where he was. He wasn't going to wait. He took the elevator to the 14th floor one last time as a man searching for answers. This time he would go up as someone who already knew the truth. If your heart is racing right now, if you're feeling every second of this revelation, subscribe to the channel. You understand that this isn't just a story about a watcher and mysterious lights. It's about trusting yourself when the whole world tells you you're wrong, about persevering when it would be easier to give up. And what Harold was about to find on that 14th floor would be even more shocking than he could have imagined. The elevator ascended with agonizing slowness. Harold gripped the flashlight so tightly his fingers turned white. Each second felt like an eternity. When the doors finally opened on the 14th floor, he practically ran down the dark hallway, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He unlocked the main door of Jacobson & Associates with hands that now trembled with pure adrenaline, not fear or doubt. He entered the ghostly office once more, but now with a clear purpose burning in his chest. "Where are you?" Harold murmured to the void. "I heard you. I understood your message. Where are you?" He searched room by room with an urgency he hadn't shown on other nights. He checked under desks, inside cabinets, behind partitions. He looked at the ceiling, searching for trapdoors. He tapped on the walls, looking for hollow spaces. Nothing, absolutely nothing to indicate where someone might be hiding or being held captive. That's when he heard sirens down in the street. Harold ran to the window and saw 2 Detroit police cars parking in front of the building. His heart leaped. They came. They really came this time. He ran down the stairs. He didn't have the patience to wait for the elevator, and found 2 policemen entering. The lobby. One of them was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with the demeanor of someone who still took his job seriously. The other was older, experienced, with the weary expression of someone who had seen it all and was clearly skeptical about being there. "Are you Harold Mitchell?" asked the older policeman. That's me, he's on the 14th floor. I decoded the message. It's Morse code. Someone's been trapped there for months, calling for help. The older policeman exchanged a look with his partner. That look Harold knew well, the one that said, "Here we go again, another lunatic." But the younger officer seemed genuinely interested. Morse code? Seriously? Through the lights? Harold nodded affirmatively, showing his notebook with the translations. "Look, I know you think I'm crazy. I know I called here several times and seemed paranoid, but I deciphered it. It's Morse code. Help. Trapped. 14F. Someone is trapped up there and will die if we don't do something now." Perhaps it was utter desperation in Harold's voice. Perhaps it was sincerity in his eyes. Perhaps the operator who forwarded the call had a good heart and marked it as a priority. Or perhaps the younger officer simply believed it was better to verify than to ignore it and then discover he was wrong. "All right, let's take a look," said the younger man. "But sir, if we don't find anything, this needs to stop. Do you understand?" Harold agreed immediately. "If you don't find anything, I'll retire tomorrow and never bother you again. Word of honor." They went up together to the 14th floor. Harold opened the door with his master key. The police officers entered with powerful flashlights, much brighter than Harold's, illuminating every corner of that abandoned office. They checked the main rooms, the bathroom, the dusty break room, the meeting room with chairs still arranged around a long table. They checked cabinets, under desks, inside a side storage room. Nothing. Not a sign of life. Not a hint that anyone was there. Harold saw the officers' expressions changing. The older one was already openly rolling his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, there's no one here. The floor is empty, just like you said it was. Maybe you should—" That's when Harold shouted, with an intensity that made both officers jump. "Wait! There's a maintenance closet in the back, behind the file room. Check it out." The older officer sighed, but the younger one was already moving. "Let's just take a thorough look since we're here," he said. They walked to the back of the office past rows of dusty files and found a narrow door marked "Maintenance Authorized Personnel Only." It was locked. The younger officer knocked. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. He knocked harder. "Detroit Police Department. If anyone's there, make some noise." And then they heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible noise, like knocks coming from far away, muffled by layers of material. Knock, knock, knock. The three men looked at each other. The older officer immediately picked up the radio. "Central, this is Car 47. We need backup and rescue personnel at the Empire State Building, Woodward at Grand Boulevard, 14th floor. Possible person in danger." And what they were about to find behind that door would change not only Harold's life, but reveal a truth that would put dozens of other lives at risk. The next 15 minutes were a whirlwind of frantic activity. More vehicles arrived, firefighters with rescue equipment, paramedics with stretchers and medical kits. The 14th floor of Detroit's old Empire State Building, which had been a silent tomb for months, now pulsed with voices, crackling radios, and the intense glow of professional flashlights cutting through the darkness. Firefighters broke down the door of the maintenance closet with a battering ram. Inside, they found exactly what they expected: old shelves with dried-out cleaning products, rusty buckets, broken brooms. But the banging continued. It came from inside the wall. One of the firefighters, a man named Davis with 20 years of experience, pressed his ear to the wall and knocked back. The knocks responded, more urgent now. "There's someone in there. We need to break through this wall." They began tearing down the drywall with tools, creating an ever-widening hole. Old dust filled the air, making everyone cough. Behind the first layer of wall, they found another, and behind that, old bricks. The building's original 1960s construction had layers upon layers, shoddy renovations piled on top of each other over decades. That's when they discovered the hidden truth. Behind a false wall that someone had probably built in the 80s during a renovation, there was an old ventilation duct, one of those huge, corroded metal ones that served the entire building's air conditioning system before being deactivated and sealed. Someone had simply built over it, hiding the duct, turning it into a forgotten empty space between the walls. And inside that duct, in a darkness that hadn't seen daylight for decades, was Marcus Washington. He was 34 years old, though he looked 60 when they finally pulled him out. His body was skeletal, the skin stretched over his bones in a way that made Harold look away. Torn and filthy clothes, matted hair, hands. Jesus, Marcus's hands were a nightmarish sight. Burns, deep cuts, torn fingernails, swollen and bleeding fingers. The paramedics started working immediately, checking vital signs, putting on an oxygen mask, preparing intravenous fluids. The story began to unfold behind the scenes as investigators spoke with Marcus between moments of lucidity. He was homeless, having lost his apartment 6 months earlier when he was fired from his job as a printing assistant. 3 months ago, on a cold June night, he had entered the building seeking shelter. He knew the place. He had worked there years before making deliveries. He knew the 14th floor was empty. He went up, forced open a back window, and entered, looking only for a safe place to sleep. But while exploring the abandoned offices in the dark, perhaps looking for a sofa or some comfortable place, Marcus stepped on a section of the floor that was rotten. The wood gave way under his weight, and he fell straight through the floor, plummeting 3 meters into the sealed ventilation duct. The impact left him stunned, possibly with broken ribs. When he regained consciousness, he was in total darkness. Complete. Absolute. The kind of darkness you never experience in modern life, where there's always some light leaking from somewhere. Marcus screamed for help for days. No one heard. The duct was very isolated, very deep inside the building structure. He had his cell phone, but there was no signal in there. The battery died in 2 days. He had some granola bars in his pocket, his only food. They lasted 3 days. After that, nothing. Only the water dripping from a broken pipe somewhere above him, which he managed to collect. By licking the cold metal of the duct. That's what kept him alive. But Marcus had something most people don't. He had served briefly in the Coast Guard before personal problems destroyed his life. And there, he had learned Morse code. When he realized no one was coming, when he understood he would die there if he didn't do something drastic, he began to explore his small space, using his sense of touch. He found the old electrical wiring still running through the duct. With his bare hands, he ripped off the plastic insulation. He connected and disconnected the wires, creating controlled short circuits that made the floor lights flicker on and off. Morse code, his last hope, his only way to scream to the outside world. Help. Trapped. 14F. He repeated those 3 messages hundreds of times over 3 months, even when his hands bled, even when the pain was unbearable, even when part of him had already given up hope that anyone would understand. When the paramedics finally stabilized him enough to transport him, Marcus was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness. But in a moment of clarity, his eyes met Harold's in the midst of the confusion. He extended a trembling hand, and Harold carefully grasped it, aware of the horrific wounds. Marcus whispered in a hoarse voice he hadn't used in weeks, You saw... Thank you." And then he fainted, quickly being taken to the ambulance waiting for him downstairs. If you have tears in your eyes right now, if you're feeling the weight of this transformation from a potential tragedy to a miracle, subscribe to the channel. You understand that these are the stories that need to be told. Stories about the power of persistence, about never giving up on people, about how an act of care can literally save a life. But this story was far from over, because Marcus's discovery would reveal something even more disturbing about that building. The ambulance sped off, sirens echoing through the Detroit night, taking Marcus Washington to Henry Ford Hospital. Harold stood in the middle of the street, watching the red lights disappear into the distance, still processing everything that had just happened. His legs trembled. He leaned against a police car, and only then did he realize he was crying. 3 months. 3 months he had carried this weight, this certainty that something was wrong, and now, finally, the truth had come to light. He had saved a life, but the story was far from over, and what would come next would reveal a much greater impact than anyone could have imagined. In the following days, the Detroit Department of Construction sent a team of structural engineers to inspect the building. What began as a standard procedure after the rescue quickly turned into an urgent investigation. The engineers discovered that the floor that had collapsed beneath Marcus was not an isolated case. Structural rot, caused by decades of unrepaired leaks, water seepage, and negligent maintenance, had spread. Like a silent cancer through several floors of the building. The 14th floor was particularly compromised. Entire sections of the floor were weeks, perhaps days, away from catastrophic collapse. The chief engineer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, gave an interview that would be reproduced on all local news channels. If this building had continued operating normally, without this discovery, we estimate that within 2 to 4 weeks, we would have had a structural collapse of the 14th floor. Considering that the floors below were occupied with offices operating during business hours, we are talking about a potential 40 to 50 people who could have been on that floor, or the floors directly below, at the time of the collapse. She paused, letting the gravity of the words sink in. Mr. Mitchell didn't just save Mr. Washington, he saved everyone. The transformation in public perception of Harold was instantaneous and overwhelming. The crazy security guard, who had been ignored, ridiculed and treated as paranoid, became a national headline overnight. Lone hero saves dozens after months of ignoring signals. Detroit Free Press. Security guard decodes Morse code SOS and prevents tragedy. CNN. How a 68-year-old man refused to give up and changed everything. NBC Nightly News. The story had all the elements that capture the collective imagination: persistence against all odds, validated intuition, an unlikely hero, and a happy ending snatched from the jaws of tragedy. Harold gave interviews, embarrassed by all the attention. He repeated the same thing in each one. I just did my job. I paid attention. That's all anyone should do, pay attention. But to the world, he was much more than that. He was a symbol that persistence pays off, that trusting your instincts matters, that an ordinary person doing the right thing can change the course of dozens of lives. Jennifer, his daughter, apologized, crying. Dad, I'm sorry for not believing you, for thinking. You were getting paranoid. You saved that man. You saved all those workers. Harold just hugged her and said it was okay, that she was just worried about him, as a good daughter should be. And Marcus? Marcus Washington spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and multiple hand infections. But he survived. Against all odds, his resilient body recovered. The impact of his story mobilized a wave of public support. Homeless assistance programs contacted him. A local social reintegration organization offered him temporary and then permanent housing. A logistics company in Detroit, touched by the story, offered Marcus a job in the warehouse. Nothing glamorous, but stable, with benefits. A real fresh start. Marcus visited Harold a month after leaving the hospital. The two men sat in the building's lobby, which was now completely evacuated while undergoing massive structural renovations, and talked for hours. I was there in the dark, losing hope, Marcus said, looking at his hands, which still showed deep scars. And I thought, nobody will see this, nobody will understand. But you saw, you understood. You refused to stop searching. Harold shook his head, modest as always. You fought to survive. You used every ounce of strength you had to send that signal. I just had to be paying attention. The journeys of both men intertwined in a way neither could have foreseen. Two strangers, separated by walls and circumstances, connected by an ancient language of dots and dashes. But there was still one last powerful lesson that this whole experience had to teach. When we look at this extraordinary story of Harold Mitchell and Marcus Washington, it's impossible not to draw profound lessons that go far beyond a dramatic rescue in Detroit. This isn't just a story about flashing lights or Morse code. It's a powerful manual on how to live with purpose, mindfulness, and courage in a world that constantly tells us to look the other way, to avoid involvement, to accept easy answers and move on. So what exactly can we learn from Harold? Let me show you 3 truths that this journey reveals. First lesson: Never ignore your intuition. Harold knew, with every fiber of his being, that something was wrong on that 14th floor. It wasn't intellectual knowledge, it wasn't something he could prove in a report or show on a spreadsheet. It was that visceral feeling, that inner voice that screams when something doesn't fit the normal pattern of things. And everyone around him, the building management, the police, even his own daughter, told him he was wrong, that he was seeing things, that he needed to stop worrying. But Harold trusted himself. That decision to honor his own perception, even under massive social pressure to abandon it, was what separated life from death for Marcus Washington. How many times in your life have you felt that something was wrong, but let other people convince you otherwise? How many times have you silenced your own inner voice because it was easier, more comfortable, less conflicting? Second lesson, persistence saves lives. Think about that for a moment. Harold could have given up on the second rejected call to the police. Hell, most of us would have given up. Surely on the 5th call, when he was explicitly threatened with consequences for wasting public resources, 99% of people would have thrown their hands up and said, "I tried. It's not my responsibility." But not Harold. He made 10 calls. He kept documenting in his notebook even when it seemed pointless. He climbed that 14th floor night after night even when he found nothing. Persistence isn't glamorous. It isn't dramatic. It's waking up day after day and continuing to do the right thing even when there's no evidence that it's working. Even when you look crazy to everyone else. Even when it would be so much easier to just stop. That trait, more than any special skill or talent, is what turns ordinary people into heroes. Third lesson, and perhaps the most important for our time, pay attention to detail. We live in an age of perpetual distraction, everyone staring at screens, everyone scrolling, clicking, consuming endless content, everyone physically present, but mentally absent. Harold was different. He observed. He knew every sound in his building, every light pattern, every shadow. He was present in the real world in a way that is becoming increasingly rare. And it was precisely this meticulous attention to detail that allowed him to notice when something changed, when a new pattern emerged. If Harold had been like most of us, spending his nights looking at his cell phone, watching videos, distracted by 1,000 things, Marcus Washington would have died in that duct. It's that simple. Attention saved a life. Harold Mitchell teaches us a fundamental truth about heroism that Hollywood and comic books have completely distorted. Heroes don't wear capes. They don't have superpowers. They aren't billionaires with advanced technology. Sometimes they wear faded security uniforms and carry old, barely functioning flashlights. Sometimes they are 68-year-old widowers whom everyone considers boring. Sometimes heroes are simply those people who refuse to stop caring, who can't turn off their compassion even when it would be more convenient, who insist on doing the right thing even when no one is watching or applauding. The transformation Harold underwent, from forgotten security guard to national hero, didn't change who he was inside. He had always been that person. The difference was that now the world was paying attention to him in the same way he had always paid attention to the world. If this message resonates with you, if you feel you might need to start paying more attention, trusting your instincts more, persevering a little longer, even when it's difficult, subscribe to the channel. We are building a community of people who believe these qualities matter, that doing the right thing is worthwhile, that an individual can make a difference. And now let me tell you what happened to Harold and Marcus after the cameras stopped rolling, after the headlines disappeared. 5 years have passed since that September night in 2019. Harold Mitchell is now 72 years old, and his life has taken a turn he could never have imagined during those lonely nights patrolling empty hallways. He is no longer just a night watchman. Today, Harold works as a specialized security consultant, hired by building management companies throughout the state of Michigan to train new generations of security guards and watchmen. But what he teaches goes far beyond standard procedures and emergency protocols. Harold teaches something that isn't in any official manual. He teaches people to listen to what the buildings are saying. In his monthly workshops in Detroit, Harold tells his story and then spends hours teaching security professionals how to develop what he calls Deep situational awareness. It's not about cameras or cutting-edge technology, although those things have their place. It's about intimately knowing the space you protect, about noticing when something changes, even if it's a tiny change, about trusting your instincts when something seems wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly why. You're not just guarding property, he tells the new guards sitting in his training sessions. You're guarding lives, and sometimes saving a life simply means being present enough to notice what no one else is seeing. Marcus Washington also transformed his traumatic experience into something purposeful and impactful. Now 39, Marcus has become a motivational speaker, traveling to schools, companies, and rehabilitation centers, sharing his extraordinary story of survival and second chances. He speaks openly about his journey, how he lost everything, how he ended up on the streets, how he faced 3 months of absolute darkness and despair inside. That duct. But the main focus of his talks isn't the tragedy. It's about resilience, about finding hope in the most unlikely places, about how each person has the capacity to send signals even in their darkest moments. The scars on his hands became part of his presentation. He shows them to audiences, explaining how each cut, each burn represents a choice he made to keep fighting, to keep sending that signal, even when it seemed completely futile. I was in the darkest place possible, he says, his voice heavy with genuine emotion that never diminished even after telling the story hundreds of times. And I had 2 options, give up and die, or keep believing that someone somewhere was paying attention. I chose to believe, and Harold Mitchell proved me right. Harold and Marcus became close friends, a connection forged in extraordinary circumstances that only they truly understand. They have dinner together once a month and occasionally give joint talks where they tell the story from different perspectives, the watchman who saw the signs and the man who sent them. The chemistry between them is palpable, a combination of gratitude, mutual respect, and a shared understanding that they have gone through something that has fundamentally changed them. And the building, Detroit's old Empire State Building, underwent a complete structural renovation that took 2 years and cost millions of dollars. All systems were modernized. Structural flaws were corrected. The building was transformed from a deteriorating safety hazard into a modern and safe commercial space. But the most significant change isn't structural, it's symbolic. At the building's main entrance, right next to the polished glass doors, there's now a bronze plaque set into a marble wall. The plaque has the words engraved in elegant lettering, "This building remembers. Thank you, Harold Mitchell." Below, in smaller print, is a brief summary of the story, how the persistence of a night watchman saved a life and prevented a tragedy that could have taken dozens of others. Employees who work in the building today pass by this plaque every day. Many don't even know the full story, but some stop, read it, and for a moment reflect on the impact an attentive person can have. The plaque has become part of the building's identity, a permanent reminder that places are more than just concrete and steel. They hold stories, memories, and sometimes, thanks to people like Harold, miracles. But before I finish, I have one last question for you. And you, are you paying attention? That's the question that remains, because this story of Harold and Marcus isn't just about a dramatic rescue that happened a few years ago in Detroit. It's about a choice that each of us faces every day. The choice to be truly present, to trust our intuition, to persevere even when it seems futile, to care even when no one is asking us to. Think about it. How many times have you passed by someone who needed help, but were too busy to notice? How many times have you sensed something was wrong but convinced yourself you were imagining things? How many times have you almost made a difference but given up a step before the result? Harold shows us that the distance between indifference and heroism is often just the decision to keep paying attention. If you've made it this far, to the end of this story, it already tells me a lot about you. You're someone who values these kinds of messages, someone who believes that real stories about real people make a difference, and that's exactly why I'm inviting you to subscribe to the channel. Because every week I bring you stories like this, stories that the mainstream media doesn't tell, about unsung heroes who deserve to be celebrated, about profound lessons hidden in extraordinary events. And leave a comment saying, "I'm paying attention," if this message resonated with you, if you felt that this story somehow reminded you of something important that you may have forgotten. I read all the comments, and it's amazing to see how these stories resonate differently with each person. Leave a like too, because that helps more people discover stories like Harold and Marcus's. And look, there's a video over here about another true story that will show you the power of a simple decision at the right time. Click and continue watching over there. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring enough to watch until the end. And remember, the world needs more people like Harold, people who pay attention, who persevere, who refuse to stop caring. Until the next video.